You're listening to the Pink Tax Podcast, where being a woman costs more and we've got the receipts. From overpriced razors to underpaid roles, we're talking money, power, and the price of showing up. Let's get into it. Welcome back, everyone, to this episode of the Pink Tax Podcast. Today, I am joined by Sarah Kaplan, who is the Professor Emerita and Founding Director of the Institute for Gender and the Economy at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. She regularly advises corporations, governments, and agencies on policies related to environmental, social, and governance issues, such as board diversity, board governance, care work, employment, pay equity, and inclusive innovation. In recognition of her contributions, she was named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women. So thank you so much for joining me, Sarah.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So I want to dive right in. Before we jump into your professional life, I would love to know what actually got you interested. What's a little bit about your story that had you interested in founding Gender and the Economy?
Yes, well, it's a good question because my whole background as a consultant and then as an early academic was all around innovation scholarship. So I was really thinking about how organizations participate in and respond to technological changes and other kinds of changes. But I always had an interest in, issues of inequality as a kind of sideline. And then in 2015-16, I just realized I couldn't do this as a side gig anymore. I needed to really focus my life, my scholarly work and my efforts really on dealing with these issues of inequality. And one of the things that really provoked it was in 2016, in addition to, elections that were happening in the US and all of that, it was the 30th anniversary of me having graduated university. And I started reflecting on how things had changed or not, since that time. And I realized not as much as we had hoped, not as much as we had been promised. Excuse me. And so I thought to myself, well, why? We've been trying. There's been lots of efforts, lots of conversation, lots of discussion. Companies are trying to do things. Governments are trying to do things. Why haven't we made more progress? And one of the things that occurred to me was that a lot of times these conversations and these policies and these practices were based in tired tropes, things that we say, like women are, more risk averse, or women just choose to, work in low paying jobs or whatever. And I was like, these aren't actually true. And we know this as academic scholars. We know that they're not true, but that truth from the science of the work that we do is not getting out into the world, not getting out into the conversations. It's not informing what companies do. It's not informing what policymakers do. And so I said, we need a platform to do that. And so I founded the Institute for Gender and the Economy because I really wanted to mobilize scholarly research to make it clear what we do know and about what works, what doesn't work, and what's really going on, the underlying dynamics. And so, the effort has been both to support scholars who are doing this kind of work, but also support the translation and communication of those ideas into the policymaking world and the corporate world so that we can actually do things that'll be more effective. And so that was my goal, was just like, we're saying tired things that aren't true, and we should at a minimum be trying to do things based on things that we actually know from scientific scholarship.
I love that. And, I think you hit on a couple of really great points there. One is we've made progress in kind of all of these areas, but sometimes it feels really slow. And I think both things are kind of true, right? It's only been kind of one generation of women's financial independence, but at the same time, we still hit up against all of these barriers, and we still kind of have those same, like you say, tropes that happen in the workplace, and they just keep getting repeated, even if they're not true at all.
Right. Absolutely. So hopefully we've been doing some myth busting around those things to say, like, yeah, you might think this, but actually this other thing is true. You might think women are more risk averse, but actually they're not more risk averse. And in fact, given all of the issues that are stacked against them, the bias, the lack of funding from venture capital, the lack of promotions, actually for women to choose to do something is riskier. So, you might say women aren't taking risks, but in fact, to ask them to do the exact same thing as a man might do in an organization, they're actually having to take more risk. And so trying to reframe things around what actually we know from the research.
And that's an uphill battle in itself, right? Reframing how we actually talk about things in society.
Yep.
Okay. My next question for you is, there's an argument around the business case for gender diversity. And, we've all heard it. It costs companies a lot of money if they don't have gender diversity or really diversity of any kind. But I think that can kind of sometimes impede change. So what does the pressure to prove kind of a return on investment or an ROI for including women does that set a higher bar for women to get into those roles? And does it actually distract from some of the systemic change that we need to have happen?
How many hours do we have to talk about this?
I mean, I'm good for as many as you want, but
it's such a great question. And so I want to approach it from a couple of different angles, because I first want to say that point that you made about creating an unfair bar. If you have to make the business case for including a woman, a person of color, an indigenous person, a person with disabilities in an organization, you're basically saying that they have to be better than the status quo. So better than an organization that's dominated, for example, by whichever privileged groups happen to be in that organization. And so you're saying, oh, well, if you add a woman to a board and performance doesn't improve because of that, then we shouldn't have added women to boards. And so it's creating this unfair standard, like you have to be better than the status quo. Now, that isn't to say I don't think that adding people to women or more diversity to boards, more diversity to organizations isn't hugely beneficial. There's so much research that shows that increases the innovation of an organization. It reduces the risk profile. It increases the ability to participate in corporate social responsibility. It often mitigates against corporate malfeasance. Like there's just a million ways. So the business case is for sure there. But that's different from the pressure to make the business case. And that's my second point, which is this fact that we are being pushed to make the business case means that we are limiting our imagination about what we could do. Because when you make a business case, you have to attach numbers to things and put them in a spreadsheet. And that's sometimes hard to do, especially with things that pay off over a longer term or in more subtle ways, in kinds of things that are hard to measure, good for your organization, but very hard to measure. And so it forces you to kind of say something narrow and small as opposed to something big and transformational for the organization. So it narrows our imagination about what could be possible. And then the third thing that I will say, just because if you don't stop me, I will go on forever, is that I've been doing research on this, on the business case, and comparing it to the impact it can have on decision making, like even recruiting decision making, promotions decision making, things like that, and comparing the business case to the legal case to the social justice kind of moral case. And the evidence is very clear that of those three cases, the business case is the least effective in actually motivating action. That legal case is better than the business case, and actually the social justice case, moral case, is the most effective in motivating action in organizations. And so people are more motivated by these other kinds of cases. Even though the business case ultimately exists, they're more motivated by the moral case. And yet we make the business case, so in fact we are failing to motivate organizations to make change. And then you might ask, well, why do people keep making the business case then? You know, that's what your question was. We feel this pressure to make the business case. Well, because another part of the study that we did was we asked other people to predict the outcome of the first study that I just described. And what we found is everyone thinks that the business case will be the most effective, convincing other people, even though they themselves say the business case is not the most effective in motivating me. I think everyone else is motivated by the business case, even though, in fact, everyone is motivated by the social justice case. And so we make the business case because we think it motivates other people, but it doesn't motivate other people, but we get in this do loop because that's what we think motivates people. And so that's why I think we're stuck in this business case conversation, it's not that the business case doesn't exist. It's that the making of the business case is keeping us from actually making any progress at all. And so it's a very difficult nut to crack. But I just think this over reliance on the business case is in the narrow form of give me the spreadsheet, with the number, prove to me there's an ROI, put a number against it, is damaging to actually making progress.
Well, and I think to that point, like, you can put numbers to things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are accurate or true numbers, right? We can't see into the future. There are so many different variables that impact all of those things on a daily, monthly, weekly basis. And I think trying to put a number to something like that is kind of impossible because, again, you can't control so many aspects of it.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I spent many years working with companies when they were doing mergers and acquisitions, and every spreadsheet has the sales will be short in the, low in the first 5 years, but then we'll have a hockey stick of performance in out years. And we're totally willing to do that when we know it's strategically important. It's an acquisition we need to make for competitive positioning or other reasons that are hard to quantify. We just put the hockey stick in. But then when it comes to more diversity and inclusion, which has the same potential strategic benefits for the organization, no one will put a hockey stick in. So I think that's a problem. The other problem is when you get to a moment like now, excuse me, where there are economic downturns, big crunches, we're dealing with all of the dislocation that's happening in the economy right now, whether it's because of political situation or because of the environment and things like that. People, if you make the business case, there's research that suggests that that's the first thing that people shed. So we have to constrain ourselves. The first thing we get rid of is that diversity effort that we were doing, even if that diversity effort could actually contribute to the organization being more resilient and more robust over the long term. It's somehow the first thing to go when it was founded in a business case, as opposed to, say, a social justice or a legal case. So there's that side of it too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I could probably have guessed that the legal case would be stronger than the business case because nobody wants to get sued. But I'm very interested that the social justice case is the driving factor. I think I come from the accounting world, and every CFO I've ever talked to was, focused on the numbers. And so I think it is really interesting and I guess hopeful to hear that the social justice case actually is more impactful.
Yeah. If you want to move people in your organization, that's a better way to move people. I think most human beings want to, are motivated by not just making money, but by something more, something that will allow them to self-actualize. And if you just say this will make you more money as opposed to giving it some kind of purpose, I think that's just not as motivating to people.
Yeah, that, we kind of lead into my next question, which is obviously we get political on this podcast, but there has been a lot of DE&I rollback in both the US and we've seen companies in Canada roll back these programs that they have. And so how have you seen in your work and your research changes occurring in this landscape? It kind of feels like we've taken, 2 steps forward. We were making really great progress or good progress. And then now it feels like we've really taken a step back in these past year or two.
Yeah, well, more than a step back. I mean, really, we're in some ways, if you look at what's happening in the US, I mean, we're going back 20, 30, 40 years or more. So lots of terrible steps back. I will say, so let me try to be slightly more hopeful about this moment, okay, since I think most of us spend our time hand wringing, and there's a million reasons to wring our hands because it's terrible. However, I do think that one of the reasons we have the backlash is that it's not just people who are against diversity and inclusion for whatever ideological reason or for whatever racist reason or sexist reason or whatever. It's also people who actually want to have more inclusion inside organizations, who have been equally frustrated with diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts inside organizations. So the way that it has been done up until now by many organizations is not satisfying anyone. There's been a lot of pinkwashing. There's been a lot of training programs that don't work because they're forced on people. And we know that from research that if you force a training program on someone, then they're more likely to resist and to actually harden their views. There's a lot of efforts that are, not to be selfish because I'm an academic, but not research informed, not informed by what the evidence says is the thing that's actually going to work. And so a lot of people feel like they're doing busy work or they're doing things that they don't see the impact on their own job, on their own lives, on their own work, on their own performance. And so there's just been a lot of frustrations. And up until the recent kind of massive wave of backlash, I was one of the people expressing those frustrations. I've pulled back from that because I don't want to feed into some narrative that diversity inclusion isn't good, because it's absolutely 100% good in an organization if you manage it well. But I think what's happening now is that organizations that were just pinkwashing don't have to anymore. They're freed up. There's no, big social pressure to do that. In fact, there's a lot of social pressure from, because of the political waves of things going on to not do it. So it's basically getting rid of organizations that were only pretending to begin with. And then the organizations who get it, the organizations who understand that inclusion in organizations is central to their long-term survival in terms of the war for talent, in terms of the robustness of organizations, in terms of their ability to innovate, their ability to stay ahead of the competitive pressures. The ones who get that are just embedding it in everything they do. Maybe they're not calling it DEI because now that word has got flames all around it, but they're just doing it. And so the one silver lining that I can offer to you is it's getting rid of the pinkwashers, and that's probably a good thing. And it's helping the organizations that truly see and understand what those benefits could be, is helping them just embed it in everything they do. So my hope is coming out of that we will have wiped away all the people who are pretending, and those organizations who figured out how to embed it are going to be the winners, in terms of their performance, their ability to innovate, their ability to attract talent over the long run. And so we are seeing the foundations of the winning companies being laid right now as those who figuring out how to just really embed it in everything that they do.
I love that. How long do you think it will take to see the, fruits of their labor, for lack of a better term, like laying this DE&I work into their foundation of their company? I don't know if you have a number, but I'm curious, is it 5 years and we start to see these companies kind of beat their peers in a variety of different ways, or is there a 10-year thing? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think we can put a number against it, because it's really going to depend on the individual company and the individual sector and things going on in the economy. So right now, it's really hard for someone graduating university to get a job. It just is. So when they can afford to be picky, they're going to look at the organizations. And I've seen so many quotes about this and so much research about this. They look and they see, is the board diverse? Is the leadership diverse? Am I interviewing with a diverse team? Are these the kind of people that I can relate to? And when they have the opportunity to pick, they are going to pick in that way. So right now, maybe they can't be picky because they're just looking for a job, but that's going to change. I have now in my career been through many economic cycles, and at some points employees can be picky and at other points they can't. And to the extent employees can be picky, an organization that is more diverse and more inclusive is going to win out. So many organizations are going to lay the foundation for that winning even now, because they're building up their leadership teams that look more diverse and their boards that look more diverse and all of that. But in the shorter run, every company has to be able to innovate, or you're going to die. I've been writing about that for more than, 30 years. And creative destruction and all of that. And the way to get innovation is to make sure that you are seeing to the periphery. You're seeing the different kinds of ideas. You are not doing what everyone else is doing. You're not following the status quo. You're being willing to take risks. All of these kinds of things that more diverse organizations help you do. Because greater diversity, creates some discomfort because there's all these different points of view. It's not as comfy and cozy as maybe it always is, but that discomfort is the source of innovation. And right now, companies are fighting to, compete in a marketplace that is churning faster and faster and faster. And so I think there's a lot of short-term benefits that organizations are going to see just in their ability to innovate that are going to come if they are the ones who are doing the recruiting of and promotion and development and coaching and all of that stuff of a more diverse team.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a lot of great points there. And we are in a little bit of a economic downturn, and especially the youth unemployment rate and the unemployment rate of those like graduating university right now is really tough, I think, for people kind of coming out of university. So, my hope is obviously as well that they eventually choose companies that are kind of doing the right thing and walking the walk as opposed to just kind of talking the talk.
Yeah. I mean, to the extent that young people, and I can say this now because I'm not so much of a young person anymore, but these younger generations, to the extent they have a choice, they're going to choose on these kinds of things. And so if you're not positioned, you can't, when the market gets tight again, when we go back to a true war for talent, you can't then suddenly pretend that you're diverse. You have to build that up over time. So this is an investment that you have to start. If you're not doing it yet, you better start.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Switching gears a little bit, you have challenged in some of your work the notion of workplace meritocracy. So I'm wondering if you can explain why meritocracy doesn't work and maybe also give a definition of what meritocracy actually is.
Yeah, well, it's a great question because I think most of us think we work in organizations that are meritocratic, and we all hold that up as kind of an ideology. We live in a meritocracy. May the best person win. The reason that women or people of color, people with disabilities don't get promoted or don't get hired is because they just weren't good enough, right? That's the idea. However, the problem is that we don't actually live in a meritocracy. I mean, we'd like to pretend that we do, but we don't. We have a meritocratic ideology, but if you actually look at what's going on, there's so much research evidence that suggests that, there's the classic experiments of orchestras where if you put the musicians behind a screen so you can only hear them play, but not see who they are, then you get more women being hired into play into orchestras. So is this, and that's like a canonical study, but there's so many studies like that. You submit the exact same resume, but one has a man's name and one has a woman's name. One has a signal of just being in any kind of club, and another one signals some LGBTQ identity. One has an Arabic name. One has a more kind of white sounding name. I mean, there are so many studies, I can't even tell you how many studies there are that basically show that when the qualifications are actually identical, we still seem to select the person who looks more like us, homogeneity is comfortable, and all of that. So we don't live in a meritocracy. We absolutely do not. And yet we pretend we do. We think we do. And so because we think we live in a meritocracy, then any effort to level the playing field, to actually make sure that people who are equally talented, get the opportunity, feels like unfairness to the people who have historically been in dominant positions. And so there's this rhetoric that, affirmative action or DEI is all about giving, quote, unfair advantage to women, people of color, and all that. But in fact, it's not giving unfair advantage. It's just leveling the playing field. And the problem is, and there's some wonderful research out there even on quotas, which very few companies, organizations, governments have quotas. But in the research that looks at quotas, it basically shows that when you implement a quota, you actually increase the quality. Why? Because you're forced to go out and search for talent that is, more diverse. And the people who lose out, and there's actually a paper that literally says, the perils of the mediocre white man. Basically what it's saying is that the people who lose out are people who are not good performers, not outstanding performers, but who, because of their advantage, have been able to be included over the years. And if you take away that advantage and you just say, I'm leveling the playing field, I'm going to make it equal for everyone, then there are people who have historically benefited who are not going to do well. And I think there's a lot of people in positions of privilege who are worried that they're one of those mediocre people. And so I think that's what's happening, is that there's this fear that I'm going to lose out. And therefore, I think that this is unfair. But if we had a true meritocracy, then truly the best person would win. We just don't have one right now. And that's the challenge, is to get people to understand that what we have right now is not a meritocracy. It's actually an affirmative action system for a certain set of people who've historically had positions of privilege, and that they've benefited from affirmative action. And because there's been affirmative action on their behalf. But people don't want to see that. And it would make them feel like, I've worked hard. I'm in this position because I worked extremely hard, but other people have also worked extremely hard and have not gotten into those positions. And the question is why? It's not that you aren't working hard. It's that, did you have wind in your sails, or were you facing a headwind? And that's what people, I think, really, really struggle to understand. And this argument that I've just made is not one that, you can go to someone who really firmly believes that this is a meritocracy right now, has an ideological belief in it. I don't know if I'm going to be able to convince them, but I hope some people will open their minds to the possibility that maybe we don't have a meritocracy yet.
Yeah, I think there's a book on this. I think it's called The Myth of the Meritocracy. I don't know if I've read it, but I think there is a lot of research that does actually support that we are definitely not in one.
I will take a chance to promote a book that just came out by my good friend Emilio Castilla, who's a professor at MIT Sloan School of Management, where I got my PhD. And his book is called The Meritocracy Paradox, or Paradox of Meritocracy. Now I feel really bad that I don't know the exact title of it, because I don't have it in my hot hands yet. I've ordered it and it is in the mail. But that book summarizes all the research. He has actually done much of the research that I cited, and it is really central to the ideas that I was just talking to you about.
Okay, well, we'll make sure that there's a link to that in the show notes. Good. Because I feel like that's an area that people might want to explore, and I will definitely be picking up that book as well.
Yes, well, I know all of the research that book is based on, and it really is incredibly carefully done in terms of debunking the myth of meritocracy and actually showing, this is one of Emilio's key findings, that when you believe you're in a meritocracy, you're actually much more likely to take an action that is more biased. When you believe when you believe that you should be following kind of good procedure, you're less biased. But when you think you're in a meritocracy, it's like you let all of those checks and balances go out the window, and you end up making a decision that's more biased. So the very belief in meritocracy is leading to more bias in our society.
Interesting. Well, we'll definitely have to check that out.
Yeah.
My next question for you is, applying an innovative lens to things is kind of central to, I think, some of the work that you've done. So if we wanted to apply an innovative lens to gender equality, how would we do this? And I come at this from the angle of, I feel like, to your earlier point on why you started GATE, we have been told, women just need to be more confident, women need to lean in, women just need to put up their hand. But oftentimes we know that doesn't work, and it maybe has sometimes a negative impact on women. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on how we can actually apply an innovative lens to gender equality.
Well, it really is that question is really something that has been motivating me all along, because exactly this idea that the solution is to fix the women, or fix the disabled people, or fix the people of color, or fix the indigenous people, whatever it is, you need to fix yourself. And we're going to give you a mentor, and the mentor is going to tell you how to fit in. This idea that there's this existing system, and which is designed for only a certain category of person to succeed. And I want to talk a little bit, hopefully, can we talk about men next? Because I really want to talk about men and masculinity.
Absolutely can.
Yeah, because it's only designed for a certain kind of person to fit in, and then everyone else has to be coached and mentored into doing that. And the innovation answer to this is we need to innovate in how we do things inside organizations. We have to innovate in our own processes. So here's an example, again, of research that we did here at the Institute for Gender and the Economy. Our former doctoral student, Joyce He, who's now at UCLA, and some of our faculty here, looked at this idea of opt-in versus opt-out when it comes to promotions. So most of the time when there's a possibility if there's a job opening in an organization, you have to kind of put your hat in the ring to say, hey, I want to be considered for that role, for that promotion. That's opt-in. What this research basically does is compares that with a scenario in which everyone at a certain level in the organization or whatever is considered for the role unless they opt out. So the choice is the same. It's either whether I'm being considered or not. But in one case, you have to opt in to be considered. In the other case, you have to opt out to not be considered. And what they are able to show is that when it's opt-in, there's definitely a bias. Fewer women opt in, and it's much less likely that a woman will be promoted into that role. But when you shift it, and this is like behavioral science kind of insight, when you shift it so that it's just a choice, what they call choice architecture, you change the architecture around the choice that people are making. When you shift it to opt out, so women can still not be considered if they don't want, they can just opt out of it. Then all of the differences go away. That men and women are equally considered, and it's much more likely that a woman will be promoted because there's more women who are being considered. So that's an example of just innovating in how we do things. Could we just not change the ways we do our promotions? And so that's the kind of thing that I really want to think more about and to promote research that is looking more into what are the different ways we can innovate in how we organize that could make things better. And, just another example is we had this experiment during COVID when everyone who, not frontline workers, but many other people were able to work at home, white collar workers in particular. And that was a great experiment because then we learned, before our organizations were super resistant. Oh, you can't work at home. It'll be bad for work. And then somehow we figured it out and it was actually good. And it turns out the people who are most resistant to going back to work in person, and all these organizations are now just like forgetting all the lessons that we learned, are women, and in particularly women of color. Why? Because working, one, we have all these things that we have to do at home because society has somehow dictated that we're the primary caregivers, but also so many more microaggressions that occur at the workplace that when you're working virtually, you're much less likely to experience. So actually, it's a less abusive kind of work environment. So why couldn't we learn from that and think about how are we going to design our work so that it's more inclusive in a way that people want to come into the office, and then we make coming into the office a really awesome experience, and then people can work from home when they can work from home. But it's like we pretended like we didn't learn anything during COVID and we've just gone back. And so that's an innovation opportunity that's just been lost. So when you talk about innovation, there's lots of possibilities. We're just not pursuing them necessarily.
And I think, I was literally just talking about this we have a mom's book club where we read a book every quarter, and there is an impending school strike here in Alberta. We are recording this at the beginning of October, and there are so many moms in that group that are just like, I have no idea what I'm going to do because my company is either telling me like, I basically have to come in 5 days a week, or I have to take my vacation days or my sick days to be able to stay home with my kid who literally does not have care and is not going to be going to school. I think as of Monday is when the school strike is happening. And my point to them was like, have we learned like nothing from COVID? And it kind of seemed like it was a resounding, companies did not learn anything and are not allowing us to work flexibly or remotely.
Right. So yes, absolutely. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. And I also want to raise the question, why is it only the moms who are worried about this? Where are
I'm sure there are dads too. It's just, This is the mom's book club. Right. So there's no dads in it.
But so some dads probably are worried about this, and kudos to them. But I do think it does raise this whole question of why. And so I'm just going to take control and talk about men and masculinity right now.
That's where we're going next. So,
okay, good. Well, do you want to ask your question or?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I just want to say I've just been mulling over this study that some colleagues of mine are working on right now. It's a working paper that I just commented on, and it basically shows that after the birth of the first child, we have a long established literature that women suffer the motherhood penalty. Like they end up having to either switch jobs or take lower hours or whatever it is. They end up making less money on average. And men don't. In fact, sometimes it's a fatherhood gain, right? But then what my colleagues did, Courtney Cole and Daisy Polen, what they did is they looked at well-being, because there's some measures in the UK of well-being. And what they found is after the birth of the first child, on average, men are just not as happy. Their emotional well-being is just worse. On average, women are also unhappy. However, the unhappy ones are the ones who go back to work like full-time. And the happier ones are the ones who take a step back, maybe take a less, lower pressure job, all that kind of things. And I'm like, but they make less money, right? So in order to be happy, they have to make less money, have a less promotable job. It hurts their career prospects for their entire lives. It increases the chance that they're going to live in poverty as a retiree. Like there's a whole bunch of bad things in there. So it's really interesting that for women, it's this trade-off between happiness and like financial viability, right? And career progression. And then for men, you don't see that. But why don't you see that? You don't see it because men don't have an option of stepping back. In society, we do not give men the option of, stepping back so that they can be more responsible for their children. And so they're all working and they're all miserable. So one, you could say, oh, well, it's all about the motherhood penalty and women should just go back to work. Or you could say, what is wrong with work? That everyone who has a child is more miserable when they go back to work. What is wrong with work? And this is for men and this is for women, right? There's something really deeply wrong with work. And the one thing that we have done in society is we've kind of given women at least the choice. You can be miserable and make more money and have more career progression that maybe over the long run will make you happy, but in the short run, you're not happy. Or you can stay home and be happier, or not stay home, but reduce your responsibilities, take yourself off of the promotability track, do things like that, and be happier. Men don't even have that choice. And I think in society, one of the things we've done is we've said, men, you can't care for children because you will be seen as a loser. You will be seen as someone who's not providing for your family. You'll be seen as someone who is not promotable. You'll be seen as someone who's not masculine. And so we have not given men the option. And because we haven't given the men the option, and you probably are thinking about the ideal worker kind of idea, we have this ideal worker because men are seen as having to conform to the ideal worker. We don't give them the possibility of having a more well-rounded life where they can be more engaged in the lives of their children. And I know we've been talking a little bit as if it's a man and a woman always at home. That's very, very heteronormative. I get that families are formed in all sorts of different ways in the story, but all the research ends up being done on heterosexual couples. So I'm telling you about that research. But what would the world look like if we gave men more options to be caring? We have put men in a man box, and that has negative repercussions for men, and it has negative repercussions for women, because what it means is men can be these ideal workers, but that means women who want to involve care work in their lives end up having to take a career hit. But what if we designed work in a way that people could be carers of children, of elders, of whoever it is? You can be carers and you could be workers. And we don't have that world. And that world is as damaging to women as it is to men, or as damaging to men as it is to women. Like no one is doing well in this current system. And this research that really looks at the, emotional well-being of people. I was just reading this paper, so it's just so stark in my mind, this trade-off that organizations are asking us to make that's really kind of tragic. And so I do feel like if we paid more attention to opening up the man box, I think we could also have more opportunities to innovate in how we organize.
Yeah, I think, absolutely. And both you and I are good friends with Jake Sticka, who is doing incredible work at Next Gen Men. And I think it does challenge some of those norms. And hopefully with his work, we'll start to also see changes in organizations, because it is really important that men are engaged in child upbringing and child rearing. And have relationships with their children. It to your point, it does help their mental health. So creating a workplace that's supportive to all people and all parents, I think is only going to be better for society. Companies might not like to do it, but I think sometimes they also kind of like to resist change of the way they've kind of always done things.
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy to just get stuck in the status quo. So companies don't like to do it, but what are even organizations missing out on by not being more inclusive? I mean, one of the things that we know is that you build a lot of skills as a carer, right? Skills that are really important to leadership, like empathy, like multitasking, like organization. There's so many skills that come from being a carer that are, when you look at the list of skills that is required in the 21st century to be a good leader, those are all the skills. So anyone who is doing caring is actually building their leadership skill set. And that we don't allow men to be carers. And then if women are carers, we then don't see them as potential leaders simply because they're women and they're caring. We're missing out on both sides. And I think if leaders and organizations really thought about it, they would realize that if they thought about this question in a different way, they would see how it would strengthen the organization and build a whole cadre of future leaders that are going to be incredible for the organization over time. And so, yes, it's easy to stick to the status quo. That's what we're comfortable with. But we're just leaving so much innovation, so much money on the table by not doing it.
For sure. And I think, there are countries that are doing it, because I do think policy at the government level also has a role to play in this. So, Sweden has caretaker leave, and if you're, I guess, the other parent, you have to take some of that leave or you lose it. And I think, if Canada was to adopt something like that, I know that there is up to 5 weeks of parental leave that men can take, or paternal leave. I think we would see movement forward in this space, because it's kind of like not until you know just how much work it is to raise a small human and are involved with that, you kind of miss out on that opportunity.
It's really interesting, though, because if you look at some of the top employers, like I talked to the top employers in Toronto, many of those organizations do have second parent leave, right? They do. They give you the time. However, I've had so many young men who graduated from my MBA courses, they went into the workforce, and 5 years later, they come back and they say, I went to my employer and I said, I'm having my first kid and I would like to take this leave. And they're like, oh, won't be good for your career progression. And I'm really worried about it. And they get all this coaching and counseling to not do it.
Really?
So even when the policy is in place, so many mid-level managers are so afraid of that kind of change, of having to reorganize a little bit to, that they oppose it. And, they're afraid, oh, well, I won't have that person in that job for these 6 months. How will my team function? And I'm like, well, but then you could do cross training, and cross training would actually be really good for the organization over the long run. Why can't you see this as an opportunity for skill building and for, creating flexibility inside your team? They don't want to think that way. They don't want to think about all the opportunities that could open up by actually allowing people to take leave when they need to take leave, whether it's for elder care or child care or whatever. And so I think it's not only senior leaders who are like, I said we could do this, but it's all the middle managers who need to have a different mindset about this as well.
Well, when I was in the corporate space, I remember talking to a guy in the organization I worked for that was having a child, and I asked him like, oh, are you taking parental leave? And, he said kind of the same things like, oh, no, I'm not. I don't want it to hurt my career. And I was like, oh, you like got to the point without like understanding the point. And so I actually shifted my language from that interaction. Whenever I'm talking to a guy that is, becoming a father, I don't ask if they're taking parental leave. I have started asking them like, how much parental leave are you taking? Like it's a given. And I hope that more leaders start to do that, because I think even that small language shift can give the permission to take that parental leave within an organization.
Yeah. When are you taking your leave? How much are you taking? It's a different question. There's another paper that just came out in my email just like yesterday came through that talked about men parenting secretly, like not even talking at all about their kids or their family at work. And because there's so much pressure to, say that you don't have any obligations outside of being like a tool for the job. And I think this, the fact that men have to secretly be parents and not say that they're out of the office because they went to their kid's baseball game or they went to, whatever it is, with their phone constantly doing work so that they can seem like they're working even when they're trying to do something for their kid, is just bad for everybody. And it's going to be bad for the long-term, well-being in our society. And well-being is such an important measure of how we do in a country and in a company. And I think we're really missing out on the dividends that could be paid if we just focus more on well-being.
Totally. And I always go back to what is the point of all of this if not to make the well-being of the people in our country or city or province or world a better place. And I go back to that often, and I hope that, we start to think that way. I have a couple more questions for you. I want to shift to disclosures. So there are a lot of countries that actually mandate, well, maybe not a lot. There are some countries that mandate disclosures for things like equal pay. We know the wage gap is real. The UK is one of them. And I've seen, tech companies that operate there, they have to disclose what's the pay gap. And I've looked at some of those disclosures, and it doesn't actually seem to really move the needle that much when we compare kind of the data from, previous years to where they're at now. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on, beyond just mandating disclosures, what can we do as a country from a policy lens to actually make sure that these companies are moving the needle forward, are getting more diverse, are closing the wage gap? Have you come across anything in your research?
Well, it's a good point, because I think a lot of these mandates for disclosures, like, for example, in Canada, we have the Comply or Explain for diversity on boards, and now pay transparency at the federal level, and in the UK and in Iceland, pay transparency. So the problem with a lot of these disclosure requirements is that organizations treat them as make work. So they say, this regulator is forcing us to disclose this, so we're going to send some lawyer away or some PR person away. They're going to do it, and then they're going to just report it in a way that looks as favorable as possible to our organization or hides our performance or whatever it is. And they just treat it like make work. And the argument I've been making, I think disclosure can be extraordinarily effective if organizations actually treat it as an opportunity to learn about themselves. It's not just about disclosing to external stakeholders, although that's important, but it's also about what do you learn about your own organization and, could you do better? So in the UK, the one thing that the pay transparency law has done is it's shown that there's a lot of inequalities and gaps. But the reason for the gaps is not, everyone thinks that, a man and a woman are being paid, differently in the same job. That is not where most of the gap is coming from. Of course, there's some egregious examples and all of that, but most of the gap is coming from men and women being siphoned into different industries or different jobs. And if you look at pay transparency in the UK, what it basically shows is that there's no women in the senior roles. And so the wage gap is coming entirely from the fact that all the highly paid people are men, and women are much more likely to be clustered in the lowest pay band in the organization. So it's not about unequal pay. It's about what jobs are people being considered for, and how are they being promoted, and are they being given, profit and loss responsibility, for example? Are they, given those opportunities to get promoted? I was just thinking about, there's a whole bunch of shifting going on in the top 5 banks in terms of leadership in the top 5 banks right now in Canada. And almost every situation, there was a lot of women who left and a whole bunch of men who replaced them. There's very few women who got put into some of those top roles that came open. And I was thinking about that, especially in these times of economic downturn that we're in right now. People feel very risk averse. And so they go with the safe option. But the problem with that is that promoting women is always seen as more risky than promoting a man. We promote women on their accomplishments and men on their promise, and we have all these challenges. And so what's happening right now in this economic downturn is that women are being perceived as risky, and they're losing out on all these opportunities to get promoted through the whole chain in an organization, which is going to lead to a pipeline problem for decades. And I think organizations are missing out on this chance if they were doing disclosure and all this measurement stuff right, they would be learning about their organization and finding ways to innovate in the ways that you and I have been talking about. So it's not that disclosure doesn't have to work, but it has to be true transparency and it has to be done with a learning mindset. I mean, there are other things that, you can do, a lot of the European governments have quotas for boards, and everyone was like, this will be terrible and it'll be awful. And it turns out it's been really great on average. Organizations have done better because of the increased diversity on boards, the diversity of perspectives, not being all locked into one ecosystem of a certain kind of person who thinks a certain kind of way. And so there are examples of other things governments can do. They can do it in procurement by saying, we're not going to procure from organizations that don't have diversity plans or diverse leadership. I mean, there's all sorts of things that governments can do. There's also all sorts of things that companies can do. I talk to a lot of general counsels in major firms, and they're like, well, what can we do? And I'm like, well, make sure that the law firm that you hire, that you have diversity in the team, and, that you mandate that there has to be diversity in the partnership that's representing that is going to be working with you. There's all kinds of things that organizations could do that will have zero downside on quality, but will create these tremendous pipelines that will shift the economy in these kind of towards greater prosperity in the ways that you and I have discussed.
Well, and we've already seen actually a pipeline issue starting to happen. I don't know if you saw the Prosperity Project just released their annual report card, and the pipeline for women into senior manager roles and higher has kind of decreased about 10% in the past couple of years. So to your point, I think we're just going to see that get worse when we have kind of that scarcity mindset of we're in an economic downturn. We need to go with what we know.
Right. Yeah. And there was the Great Resignation that happened during COVID, and I think we're seeing the effects of that as well. People were just like, why am I doing this? This is not worth it. And so I do think the good organizations are the ones that are going to figure that out, and they're going to really change how they operate.
Yeah. Okay. My last question for you. If you could wave a magic wand and tomorrow you could mandate one major piece of research for every business school in the world to collaborate on, what fundamental question about gender and the economy would you want answered?
Oh, well, there won't be one piece of research, so I'm not going to satisfy you. But I will say I want to focus on interventions the question that you asked about what can organizations do? Because we have had maybe 3 decades of research. It's a little bit like climate change. I'm the Al Gore. I don't want to debate anymore whether inequality exists. It exists. Meritocracy does not exist. I'm not going to debate it anymore. And so we have a lot of research that has demonstrated that bias exists. I would love for research to shift to, okay, what are the interventions? What are the government interventions? What are the organizational interventions? What can business schools and other educational institutions, what can they do? I really feel like we need to get a, real precision on what works and under what conditions. And so I would encourage any researcher to focus on those things, but really focus on it in a rigorous way, because I think there's a lot of consultants and other people out there who are just saying stuff to say stuff, and because they have to deliver a product to sell. And I really wish we could make sure that the interventions that are being recommended really are, rigorously proven out through research.
So what I'm hearing is Netflix needs to give you your own Inconvenient Truth special.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's my next career.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of the Pink Tax Podcast. Where can people find you?
Well, they can find me at my personal website, which is sarahkaplan.info. And they can also just find all the research and resources and case studies and videos and podcasts and all those kinds of things from the Institute for Gender and the Economy at gendereconomy.org.
Amazing. And she does have some incredible resources, and I'm sure there will be lots of people that want to dive into some of the research papers we talked about today. So thank you again for joining me, and I hope everyone enjoyed this episode of the Pink Tax Podcast, and I will see you next week. And that's a wrap on this week's episode of The Pink Tax. Thank you for joining me on the front lines of financial fairness. Remember, understanding the cost of being a woman is just the start. Now it's time to demand your worth and build your wealth. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a step in dismantling systemic inequality and securing your financial future. If this episode sparked a fire in you, take a screenshot, tag us on social media, and share it with a friend who needs to join the movement. Until next time, keep your wallet guarded, your eyes open, and let's keep fighting for a world where pink is just a color, not a tax bracket.